I'm really pleased to hand over now to our first speaker, who is Maureen O'Hara. Maureen O'Hara is a radical feminist, legal, academic, and former practicing lawyer. Since late 1970s, she's been active in many feminist campaigns opposing sex-based violence, particularly in relation to the sex trade and sexual abuse of children. In recent years, Maureen's campaigning has been focusing on promoting women's sex-based rights and challenging gender identity ideology. She's co-author of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights and a member of WDI International and of WDI UK. Over to you for your talk. Oh, sorry, and your talk is titled How the Declaration Relates to the UN, but I think you might modify that to make it more accurate. So over to you, Maureen.
So I'm going to talk about, thanks Bernadette, the Declaration, and the main purpose of it was to reaffirm the rights set out for women under the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW, and the UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And we did draw on some other UN human rights instruments as well, but it was mainly those two that we had in mind when we developed the Declaration. Both of those instruments are based on the idea that women's oppression is based on our experiences as a sex. They don't talk about gender identity. They didn't have gender identity in mind when they were written. And it's very clear from the content that what they had in mind was women who are born women, who are biologically female. And one of the reasons why we decided to write the Declaration was because increasingly, because lobbying by gender identity ideology lobby groups, more and more people were talking about these human rights provisions as if they included men who claim a female gender identity. And we wanted to challenge that. Now, there are, within the UN and within groups who have links to the UN, there are women, I think, who broadly agree with us, and there are women who are very much opposed to what we're saying, as what Joe said illustrated that, banning us from forums. There are some women who support us as well. And so there's a lot of different approaches. And a good illustration, I think, of what is happening in the UN and what has been happening over recent years is that last year, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, Alsalem, wrote a letter in response to the Scottish Government's attempts to introduce gender self-ID in Scotland, which in the end didn't come to fruition for various reasons. But while they were trying to introduce that, she wrote a letter in support of single-sex spaces and services for women. And she got a lot of comeback because of writing that letter, including a letter from a number of different women's organisations and organisations who would see themselves as LGBTQ organisations as well, criticising her very strongly for having defended women's sex-based rights in that way. And they say in their letter, "We strongly hope you will reconsider your position and uphold established human rights standards regarding legal gender recognition and gender identity throughout your work." And this idea that these are established human rights standards which recognise gender identity has been increasingly introduced into various forums relating to the UN and more widely than that as well. It's been introduced into the EU. But there isn't really a strong foundation in any of the human rights instruments for saying that. In fact, there's no real foundation in the CEDAW or the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which are the key instruments relating to the rights of women that the UN produced. But nevertheless, that idea is being pushed. And one of the things we wanted to do in writing the Declaration was to challenge that. This is the CEDAW definition of discrimination under Article 1, which says that for the purposes of the present convention, the term discrimination against women shall mean any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex, which has the effect or purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise by women, irrespective of their marital status, on a basis of equality of men and women, of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. And it goes on to discuss women's rights in a range of different fields. And it's very clear, it says on the basis of sex. And the UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, this is really the core of why they established that declaration. They recognise that violence against women is a manifestation of historically unequal power relations between men and women, which have led to domination over and discrimination against women by men, and to the prevention of the full advancement of women. And that violence against women is one of the crucial social mechanisms by which women are forced into a subordinate position compared with men. Violence against women is widespread throughout the world. It's probably one of the most common, if not the most common type of human rights abuse on the planet. It exists everywhere. And we see, and I think many feminists see, that when men are allowed in law and policy to start defining themselves as women and being treated as if they're women, particularly if they're treated as if they're women in law, that undermines our attempts to challenge and fight back against male violence against women. Men who identify as women are often as violent towards women. They have a high proportion of them are sex offenders, or certainly a high proportion of trans-identifying males in the prison system in England and Wales and in other jurisdictions have convictions for sexual offences. So the fact that they identify as women doesn't stop them from perpetrating sexual violence or any other type of violence against women. The rates of violence are probably as high, if not in some instances higher, than those of other men. Now, both the CEDAW and the Elimination of Violence Against Women Declaration emphasise at various points in their wording the importance, in order to achieve the rights and the protections for women that they're aiming for, of challenging stereotyped roles for men and women, of challenging sexual stereotypes. It's mentioned in both of them, and in the CEDAW it's mentioned several times. And Article 5 of the CEDAW says that the states who are party to it should take all appropriate measures to modify the social and cultural patterns of conduct of men and women, with a view to achieving the elimination of prejudices and customary and all other practices which are based on the idea of the inferiority or the superiority of either of the sexes, or on stereotyped roles for men and women. What they're really talking about here is gender, as we would understand it, which is culturally created sex roles for men and women, within which women are given a subordinated role. That is what historically, when feminists have talked about gender, that's what we meant. Now men are saying that they have a female gender identity, and they're basing that on stereotyped ideas about what women and men are. Again, under Article 10, I won't read it all out, but it talks about the elimination of any stereotyped concept of the roles of men and women at all levels and in all forms of education. And the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women talks about states adopting all appropriate measures, especially in the field of education, to modify the social and cultural patterns of conduct of men and women, and to eliminate prejudices, customary practices, and all other practices based on the idea of the inferiority or superiority of either of the sexes, and on stereotyped roles for men and women. It's fundamental to both of these human rights instruments that women's oppression and their subordination to men is very closely tied to stereotypes about what men and women are and how men and women should behave. And what men who claim to have a female gender identity are doing is effectively turning those stereotypes into an identity. It's very clear from the way that they behave and the way that they dress that they have a concept of women which is based on sexual stereotyping. What many of them are doing is turning that sexual stereotyping into a fetish, if they're autogynephiles, and many of them are. They have a sexual fetish which involves being sexually attracted to themselves in the role of a woman. And their idea of what the role of a woman is based on stereotypes. And for many of them, the foundation of their ideas about what a woman is rooted in pornography. We know that. There's a lot of evidence to show that that's the case. So men claiming a female gender identity is fundamentally opposed. It fundamentally contradicts the ideas in the CEDAW and in the UN elimination, the Violence Against Women declaration. It undermines the protections that those two human rights instruments advocate for women and the safeguards, and it undermines the rights of women. Because it's actually turning stereotyped ideas about what men and women are into an identity and demanding that the identity is recognised in law, in social policy, and so on. So one of our key aims in developing the declaration was to challenge that and say women's rights under these two instruments are based on our experiences as a sex. They have nothing to do with gender identity, and men who claim a female gender identity should not be seen as being included within the provisions that those two human rights instruments have set out. Those instruments are to protect women and to further our rights. They're not designed to protect the rights, or more probably accurately, the entitlements of men who claim to be women. We looked at the various UN human rights provisions that specifically relate to women. We also looked at the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child as well. That's another one that we drew on in relation to the article in the declaration which talks about children. As I've just said, our view is that the idea that men can have a female gender identity fundamentally is based on sexual stereotypes and challenges the rights set out in CEDAW and in the Violence Declaration. So the declaration has 9 articles which deal with the areas in which the acceptance of gender identity, whether that's in law or in policy or in practice, most negatively affects women's ability to exercise the rights and protections which the CEDAW and the Violence Declaration were intended to create. We think it undermines them. So these are the 9 articles of the declaration, which most of you are probably familiar with. The first one, which is the foundation for all of them, is that women's rights are based on our experiences as a sex. And women in law should be defined on the basis of sex and not gender identity. Similarly, in policy and in social practice, that men should not be seen as being women in any sense of the word, that being a woman is based on having a female biology, and that the law and policy should reflect that. Secondly, that motherhood is an exclusively female status. And the idea behind that was to challenge the increasing claims that men are making that they are the mothers of their children, which is detrimental to children. It undermines, I think, children's sense of reality for a man to be telling them, I'm your mother. It is detrimental to women, and particularly women who are mothers. Being a mother and going through pregnancy is an exclusively female experience, which men cannot participate in. And it undermines women's rights, and particularly women's rights in the context of maternity, for men to claim that they can participate in it. And now increasingly, they are wanting to not only call themselves mothers, but to simulate breastfeeding. And parts of the medical profession are helping them by developing them to have a substance which is induced by hormones in their bodies through which they can simulate breastfeeding a child. We don't know enough about what effect that will have on those children, because that substance is hormone induced. But that's what they're doing. They're claiming that they can breastfeed, and they're claiming that the substance that is being produced by these hormones is as good as breast milk. That undermines, again, the status of motherhood. It's detrimental to women. It's detrimental to the real mothers of those children, and it's detrimental to women as a whole, because motherhood is an exclusively female experience in which men can't share. They can pretend to share. They can LARP as being mothers, but they're not. And it's detrimental both to women and to children, in our view, if the state in law or in policy accepts that pretense on the part of men. Physical and reproductive integrity is the third article, which is opposed to surrogacy, and also opposed to any medical research which aims to enable men eventually to become pregnant and give birth. And there is research which is looking at that. I doubt whether it will ever come to any fruition because I can't see how that could work physically. But we would like that kind of research stopped, and we would like the kind of practices that are involved in men simulating breastfeeding also to be stopped, and that the medical profession to stop pandering to those men's fantasies by enabling them to emulate breastfeeding and doing research that's aimed at enabling them eventually to give birth. Freedom of opinion and expression is Article 4. We were very conscious at the time we were writing the declaration that women's defence of sex-based rights was being met with attempts to silence us, that women were being bullied, that they were losing their jobs because they defended sex-based rights and said that men can't be women. So that's a very important aspect of the fight back against gender identity ideology. Number 5, peaceful assembly and association. It's absolutely crucial that we can meet as women without men who claim to have a female gender identity having to be included because the law says they have to be included, which in some jurisdictions is happening now. In parts of Australia, as I understand it, lesbians can't meet, can't arrange public meetings just for lesbians. Men who claim to be women and to be lesbians in law have to be included. So gender identity ideology is intruding on our rights to women-only space and women-only assembly and association. And in the long run, if that continues to happen, that will have a really detrimental effect on the women's movement and our ability to challenge women's oppression and to meet, to plan and strategize against male dominance, because it's going to become increasingly difficult to keep men out of those meetings if they claim that they're women. Similarly, number 6 is political participation. And one of the things we had in mind there was men claiming to be women taking up places which were supposedly allocated to women to increase political participation for women. So all women shortlists to take up political positions, for example. Men claiming to be women were being put on those all women shortlists. And that's something we want to stop. Participation in sports and physical education. We all know that men are now starting to play in women's sports. Women are being physically injured in some cases as a result of that. And the men involved, because of the nature of male puberty and the additional strength and speed it gives, they're taking prizes that women should be getting. In the US, where gaining certain sporting prizes can give someone a free education, which they couldn't otherwise have at university, men are taking that. So we wanted to challenge that. Number 8 is the elimination of violence against women. And as I've already mentioned, if we accept that men can claim to be women, it makes it much more difficult to challenge male violence against women. Partly because one of the things that we need to do is to be able to correctly identify in statistics and other data who is committing sexual offences and violent offences and who are the main people on the receiving end of that. Overwhelmingly, sexual and violent offences of all kinds are committed by males. And the majority of those who experience sexual violence are women and girls. And if men start claiming a female gender identity and claiming that they're women, that complicates and makes it very difficult to challenge that. And it also makes women vulnerable to being abused by males who claim to be women in single-sex spaces, and in particular prisons. And then 9 is the protection of the rights of the child, which talks about the use of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones and surgeries with minors as being a form of abuse. In fact, we described it as a new and developing cultural practice which is damaging to children. And we drew on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which emphasises only doing what's in the child's best interests, to argue that it is not in children's best interests to have their bodies permanently altered at a young age where they can't possibly give valid consent to what is being done to them. So just as an example of what we did when we were developing the declaration and how we drew on the human rights instruments, I'll talk a little bit about the UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women and what we said about some of the articles in there in the declaration. So this is Article 4G of the UN Declaration, which says that states should work to ensure, to the maximum extent feasible, in the light of their available resources and where needed within the framework of international cooperation, that women subjected to violence and, where appropriate, their children, have specialised assistance such as rehabilitation, assistance in childcare and maintenance, treatment, counselling and health and social services, facilities and programmes, as well as support structures, and should take all other appropriate measures to promote their safety and physical and psychological rehabilitation. It doesn't say specifically that those spaces and services should be single sex, but it's well established amongst organisations who work with women who are survivors of domestic abuse, of sexual violence and other forms of male violence, as well as those who work with girls, that those spaces and services work best for women when they're single-sex services. So therefore, we said in Article 8 of the Declaration that these measures should include the provision of single-sex services and physical spaces for women and girls to provide them with safety, privacy and dignity. Whether provided by public or private entities, such single-sex provision should be allocated on the basis of sex and not gender identity, and should be staffed by women on the basis of their sex and not gender identity. And as many people here will know, domestic abuse refuges, rape crisis centres, a whole range of different services and spaces that was set up during the second wave of feminism, largely. That's when they began. And what women were set up by women, for women, and staffed by women only. Increasingly, not all of them, but many of them, are providing services to men who claim to be women and are even employing men who claim to be women as refuge workers, as rape crisis advisors, and so on. And that's one of the things we wanted to stop. In Article 4K of the Violence Declaration, it talks about the importance of data on violence against women, the importance of collecting that in order to work out strategies for challenging it, because you need to know the patterns it takes before you challenge it. And Article 4K says promote research, collect data and compile statistics, especially concerning domestic violence, relating to the prevalence of different forms of violence against women, and encourage research on the causes, nature, seriousness and consequences of violence against women, and on the effectiveness of measures implemented to prevent and redress violence against women. Those statistics and finding of the research will be made public. You can't do that if you're categorising males as female in criminal justice data, for example. If you do, it completely skews the data. It can make it look as if women are committing all sorts of offences that by and large women don't commit, and they're offences that are almost universally committed by men, and that's starting to happen. So we said that this should include recognition that accurate research and data collection relating to violence against women and girls requires that the identification of both the perpetrators and the victims of such violence must be based on sex and not gender identity. And that's crucially important to challenging violence against women for a whole range of reasons. And another article in the Violence Declaration relates to women's access to justice. That's Article 4D says that states should develop penal, civil, labour and administrative sanctions in domestic legislation to punish and redress the wrongs caused to women who are subjected to violence. Women who are subjected to violence should be provided with access to the mechanisms of justice and, as provided for by national legislation, to just and effective remedies for the harm they've suffered. States should also inform women of their rights in seeking redress through such mechanisms. Now, this is being undermined by laws and policies which allow men to claim to be female, including men who are charged with sexual offences against women. And that is increasingly happening in many jurisdictions. It's happening in the UK, but it's happening in many other jurisdictions worldwide. We said that this should include the recognition of the rights of women and girls to accurately describe the sex of those who have perpetrated violence against them. Public bodies such as the police, state prosecutors, and the courts should not impose an obligation on victims of violence to describe their assailants according to their gender identity rather than their sex. And there have been instances in different parts of the world where women have been reprimanded for calling men who've assaulted them he in court, where they've been told call the defendant she, which is detrimental to women's ability to give their evidence about their experiences of sexual violence, which is a very difficult thing to do anyway in a courtroom. And insisting that women call men she when they're giving evidence about those men's violence against them undermines women's access to justice and gives defence lawyers a lot of leeway as well for playing games when women are giving their evidence in order to undermine them. Which is one of the key strategies of cross-examination. The purpose of cross-examination is to undermine the witness's testimony. And there's lots of strategies that lawyers who carry out cross-examination use to try to do that. And the ability to play linguistic games about whether a woman should call a man she or he adds to their arsenal of techniques that they can use. And it undermines women's evidence. So in regard to criminal justice, the Declaration reaffirms the rights of women to describe their men who assault them accurately as men. And also in regard to what we said about single-sex services under Article 8, we've emphasised that men should not be treated as if they're women, and that has a significant impact in lots of different areas of criminal justice, including prisons, where in the UK, some trans-identified males are placed in women's prisons, but now they're not, usually, with some exceptions, if they've committed violent or sexual offences against women. That's the case in England and Wales anyway. But there are jurisdictions where men who are convicted rapists are placed in women's prisons and even in women's cells, and where women have been assaulted by those men, and where there's an atmosphere that's created which makes it very difficult for women to report those men for their violence and threats of violence. And the placement of men in women's prisons undermines women's safety, but it also undermines women's privacy and women's dignity. And that is one of the results that takes place where states recognise in law that men can become women. Now, some states put some controls on that aspect of it and some don't, but it's the logical conclusion of recognising men as having female gender identities, that they can be placed in women's prisons even if they've committed rape against women, if people are going along with the pretense that they're women and describing in court using terms like her penis, which does happen. So that's another aspect of criminal justice, and in relation to violence against women, that the Declaration opposes. Thank you.